The bar was called The Anchor, though it sat about 600 miles from any ocean, in a base town where the tallest thing for a mile was the water tower, and the second tallest was the sign for a tire shop. I had driven past it twice before I let myself stop. It had that look a certain kind of place gets when it has survived 3 or 4 wars' worth of soldiers passing through. The paint worn down to the wood at the door handle, the windows gone soft and yellow with age. A hand-lettered notice taped inside the glass that said, "Cash preferred, no exceptions, we mean it." Places like that do not advertise. They do not have to. The men who need them can smell them from the parking lot. It was a Friday in late July, and I was reporting to my new post on Monday morning at 0800 hours, and I had exactly 1 evening in between to be nobody at all. That is a harder thing to arrange than it sounds. When you have spent as many years in uniform as I had, being nobody is a skill you have to practice, like a language you are losing. So I had left the rental car at the motel and walked the half-mile in the heat with my sleeves down and my hair loose. And I had come to the Anchor to sit at the end of a bar and drink 1 drink slowly and let the current of other people's noise carry me somewhere quiet. I took the last stool at the corner, the one with its back to the wall and a clean line of sight to the door. I did not decide to take that stool. My body took it. 14 years of habit had made certain decisions for me a long time ago, and I had stopped arguing with them. From that corner, I could see the whole room in the long mirror behind the bottles, and I could see the door, and no one could come up behind my right shoulder without me knowing. Those are not things a person chooses to care about. They are things that get installed in you, in the dark, in another country, and then they never uninstall. The woman behind the bar was somewhere in her middle 50s with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair and forearms that had carried kegs for a couple of decades. She looked at me the way a good bartender looks at everyone, which is to say, quickly and completely, and then she set a coaster down in front of me without a word and waited. I asked for a club soda with lime. She raised one eyebrow, not unkindly, and I said I was driving later, which was mostly true, and she nodded and made it and put it down and did not charge me. "First one is on the house," she said, "for anybody who sits like they are still on watch." I looked at her. She was already turning away to the taps, so I only caught the edge of her face. And there was nothing on it but the mild attention of a person who had seen everything twice. Her name, I would learn later, was June Alcott, and she had owned the Anchor for 22 years, and she had buried 2 husbands and a son who wore the same flag I did. She could tell a war from a haircut. She could tell which of the men in her bar were loud because they were happy, and which were loud because the alternative was worse. She never once, that whole night, asked me which one of those I was. That is its own kind of grace, and I did not know yet how much I would need it. I had come to know 100 towns exactly like this one. Base towns have a particular architecture of the spirit, whatever they look like on a map. There is the strip of pawn shops and quick loan places and tattoo parlors that grow up around a gate like barnacles on a hull, feeding on young men with steady paychecks and no idea yet what a paycheck is for. There is the good diner and the bad diner, and everyone knows which is which, and the good one is always the one that looks worse. There is a church on every 3rd corner and a bar on every 2nd, and there is always, if you know how to find it, one place like the Anchor, a place that does not want the young loud money, a place that has quietly decided it exists for the ones who came back different and need somewhere to sit with that. I had been stationed in 9 of these towns over the years, and I could find the Anchor of each one inside a week by instinct, the way a dowsing rod finds water. It is a useful skill and a lonely one. I drank my club soda and watched the room in the mirror. It was early still, the light outside going long and gold through the yellow windows, and the place was maybe a third full. Men mostly, a few couples, a table of women in scrubs who had clearly come straight off a hospital shift, a dartboard nobody was using, a jukebox playing something with a steel guitar in it, low. On the back wall above the register, June kept a row of framed photographs, the way these places do. Faces going back years, some in color and some not, some with little strips of black ribbon across the corner of the frame. I did not look at them too closely. I had learned not to look too closely at walls like that. There is always one face on them you are afraid you will recognize. I kept my left arm along my thigh, under the lip of the bar, where the sleeve would not ride up. That, too, was a thing my body did without asking me. It was July, and I was wearing long sleeves, and I had been wearing long sleeves in July for 13 years, and I had 100 easy explanations ready for anyone who ever asked, and no one ever asked, because I never gave anyone a reason to. That is the whole trick of disappearing. You do not hide. Hiding draws the eye. You simply arrange yourself so that there is nothing on you for the eye to catch. I should tell you who I was, though at the Anchor that night I was working very hard to be no one in particular. My name is Adele Brennan. I was born in the spring of 1988, which made me 38 years old that July, and I was a major in the United States Army Civil Affairs, with 11 years of commissioned service behind me, and, before that, the years that do not fit neatly on a slide. I had enlisted at 19 because I did not know what else to do with myself, and the recruiter's office was air-conditioned, and the man behind the desk talked to me, like I might amount to something. I have met a great many soldiers over the years who came to it that way, sideways, because a door happened to be open. We tend to stay longer than the ones who always knew. By that July, I had reached the age where the Army starts handing you responsibility with both hands. A major is a strange rank. You are senior enough that young soldiers straighten up when you walk in, and junior enough that you still do most of the real work yourself. You have stopped being the person things happen to, and started being the person who was supposed to keep things from happening to others. I was good at it. I want to be honest about that, because most of what I am going to tell you is about being underestimated. And I do not want you to think I spent my life feeling small. I did not. I knew exactly what I was worth. I had simply learned at some expense that announcing it was almost never the move. The thing about competence is that it makes you quiet. The most capable people I have ever known were the ones who had the least to prove in a room because they had already proven it somewhere that mattered, somewhere with no audience. You learn to carry it the way you carry a sidearm, close and covered, and not for show. You do not draw it because a stranger at a bar is rude to you. That would be like using a fire extinguisher to swat a fly. So when I sat at the Anchor with my one club soda and my sleeve down, I was not a woman with nothing to say. I was a woman who had decided a very long time ago that saying it cost more than it was worth. I had reported to a great many new posts in my life, and I had developed a small private ritual for the night before. The way soldiers develop rituals for everything, because the work is uncertain and the mind needs somewhere reliable to stand. The ritual was simple. The night before a new beginning, I would find the quietest good place in the new town, and I would sit in it alone for a couple of hours, and I would let myself be, for that short window, not a rank and not a role and not a set of responsibilities, but only a person, a woman of 38 with tired feet and a long history, breathing the same air as strangers who wanted nothing from her. It was how I emptied the cup before it got filled again. On Monday there would be a new commander and new soldiers, and 100 small first impressions to manage, and I would be once more the major, the one they straighten up for, the one who's supposed to have the answers. But not tonight. Tonight I was nobody, on purpose, and it was the closest thing to rest I knew how to give myself. June drifted back down the bar and refilled the club soda I had barely touched, out of habit, and glanced at my long sleeves in the July heat and said nothing about them. I liked her enormously in that moment. There are people who need to fill a silence and people who can stand inside one with you, and the second kind are rare and worth crossing a room for. Behind me the door opened and shut a few times as the evening thickened. The place filled slowly. The table of nurses laughed at something. A big man at the middle of the bar was telling a story with his hands. It was the kind of ordinary human noise that I had spent a good part of my adult life protecting, in places where it did not exist, for people I would never meet, and I let it wash over me, and I closed my eyes for a second, and I was, briefly, almost at peace. I want you to hold on to that, because a great deal of what happened next was cruel, and some of it was beautiful, and it is easy to forget, telling it, that it started with a woman being quietly, unremarkably happy for the first time in a while. The scar under my sleeve went from the inside of my left wrist up to just past the elbow, and it was 13 years old, and I could still feel the exact shape of it in the dark with my eyes shut. I do not tell the story often. I am going to tell you part of it now, because you cannot understand the rest without it, but I am going to tell it the way I actually carry it, which is in pieces, because that is how it comes back. It does not come back as a movie. It comes back as a smell or a weight or a particular quality of heat on the side of your face. And then you are there again for a half a second before you claw your way back to whatever room you are actually standing in. In 2012, I was 24 years old, and I was not technically a ranger, because in 2012, women were not rangers. What I was a soldier on a cultural support team, which is a phrase most people have never heard, and which meant in practice that I had volunteered for and passed a selection designed to find women who could go where the men could not. On a direct action objective, there are always women and children in the building, and a room full of frightened women will not be searched or spoken to by a male assaulter without the whole thing coming apart. So they trained a small number of us, hard, and they attached us to the units that did the raiding, and we went out the door on the objective behind the assault, into the same houses, on the same nights, under the same fire. We were not supposed to be operators. We were told that in about 6 different ways, and then they put us on the aircraft and flew us into the same darkness as everyone else, and the darkness did not check anyone's job description before it started shooting. The selection for that program was one of the hardest things I have ever done. And I have done a number of hard things. They ran us into the ground for days on almost no sleep. Not because the tasks themselves required a superhuman body, but because they needed to see who you became when the easy version of you was gone. That is what all real selection is for. Anyone can be disciplined and generous and clear-headed when they are rested and fed. The question the army was asking was who I would be at 3 a.m. on the 4th day, cold and exhausted and out of excuses, with a problem in front of me and no one coming to help. I found out some things about myself in that selection that I have relied on ever since. And one of them was that when everything else burns off, what is left of me is stubborn and calm and unwilling to leave people behind. I did not know then how literally I would one day be asked to prove that last part. The unit I was attached to was a Ranger battalion, and the private whose weight I still feel on my back some mornings was named Nolan Price. He was 22. He was tall and loud and impossibly young, the way they all were, the way I must have been and could not see. He carried the machine gun for his squad, and he complained about it constantly, and he would have died before he let anyone else take it. On the objective that night, something went wrong in a way I'm not going to describe in detail, because it does not need describing and because some things are not mine to hand to strangers. There was fire. There was a stairwell. Price was on the floor, and the floor was not a place anyone could stay. So I did the thing that my training and my body had prepared me to do, which is that I got him up and I got him out, down 2 flights, with the heat close enough on my left side that by the time we reached the bottom, the sleeve of my blouse was gone, and so was a good deal of the skin under it. And I did not feel any of it until much later, because that is a mercy the body extends to you exactly once. I have tried over the years to be precise with myself about what happened on that objective, because imprecision is where the guilt breeds. When you let a memory go soft and general, it fills up with everything you might have done differently, all the imaginary better versions of yourself who moved faster or saw sooner. So I hold it precise. We were in the building, the women and the children were in the back rooms, which was my job, my whole reason for being on the aircraft, and I was with them, keeping them calm, keeping them still, keeping the situation from turning into the kind of chaos that gets people killed. Then the situation changed, the way it always can, all at once, and with no warning, and there was fire where there had not been fire, and there was a man down in a place a man could not stay. And the training I had bled for in selection did exactly what it was built to do. It took the fear and set it on a shelf where I could get to it later, and it left me, for 90 seconds, with nothing in my head but the task. Get him up, get him out, down the stairs. I did not think about my arm. You do not, at the time. The body files that bill and presents it to you later, with interest. Price lived 4 days. I want you to know that, because people always assume the ones you carry out either make it or they do not. And the truth is worse and quieter than that. He lived 4 days in a hospital far from home, and I was not allowed in most of the time because I was not family. And on the 5th morning he was gone, and they folded a flag for a mother in Ohio, and I stood at the back of nothing because there was no place for me to stand. I had carried him down 2 flights of stairs with my arm on fire, and I was not family enough to be in the room. That is not a complaint. That is just the shape of the thing. But it is why, for 13 years, I kept the sleeve down. The scar was not the wound. The scar was only where the skin finally gave up arguing. The wound was a name I had stopped saying out loud because every time I said it, some part of me heard it as a confession, as if being there and not being enough were the same crime. They gave me a medal for that night, a bronze star with a small bronze letter V on it, for valor, and a purple heart for the arm, and I put both of them in a drawer, and I have moved that drawer to 9 different duty stations, without ever once opening it in front of another human being. I did not feel I had earned a thing to be proud of. I felt I had earned a thing to be quiet about. There is a difference, and if you have ever carried something out of a fire and had it die on you anyway, you know exactly what the difference is. So, that is the scar. That is the sleeve. That is the soft place that 14 years of discipline had built a wall around and could not quite close. Keep it in your mind, because in about 90 seconds, 2 young men were going to walk into the anchor and, without having the first idea what they were doing, press their thumb directly into it. They came in loud, the way men come in when they are a few beers ahead of the room and want everyone to know they are winning at the night. 2 of them, both in their late 20s, both built the way men are built when their job is being built that way, wearing the flat, expensive, casual clothes that are their own kind of uniform. I clocked them in the mirror the moment they came through the door, the same way I clocked everyone, and then I went back to my club soda and forgot about them, because being loud is not a crime, and I was off duty from caring about anyone. They took stools a few down from mine, at the corner where the bar bends, close enough that I could hear them without trying. One had sandy hair cut high and tight and a laugh that carried. His friend called him by a name I would later learn was Reinhardt, Colby Reinhardt, though at the time he was just the loud one. The other was darker, quieter, with a watchfulness under the beard that told me he was probably the more dangerous of the 2, if it ever came to that, and his name was Maddox, Trace Maddox. They were in town, I gathered from the pieces of their talk, for some course, some school, the kind of thing the Navy sends its special operators to when they need a stamp on a record. They were, in other words, exactly what they looked like. They were SEALs, and they had walked into a veterans bar in an army town feeling like the best thing in any room they entered, which, to be fair, at their age and in their line of work, they probably usually were. June served them without warmth and without rudeness, which is a bartender's most useful register, and they ordered and they drank and they got louder, and I stopped listening because the specific content of loud young men is almost never worth the effort of parsing. I was thinking about Monday, about the new office and the new faces and the careful early weeks of a new job. And I had drifted a good distance from the anchor in my head when Reinhardt's voice cut back through, closer and pointed, aimed. Hey, sweetheart. I did not turn. In my experience, sweetheart is a word that solves itself if you give it nothing to hold. But he did not let it go. He leaned down the bar, and I felt the attention of the room begin to tilt the way a floor tilts, slowly and then all at once. And he said it again, louder, performing now. Yeah, you. This is kind of an operator's bar tonight, you know what I mean? Guys who actually did the thing. He reached over, casual as anything, and slid my club soda 6 inches down the bar away from me. A small, ugly gesture that told everyone watching that my drink, and by extension me, could be moved out of the way by anyone who wanted the space. Wrong bar, sweetheart. This one is for operators. There is a wine place 2 blocks up. You would be a lot more comfortable. There were maybe 20 men in the anchor by then, and the whole room heard it, and a few of them laughed. Not all of them. I want to be fair to that bar, but enough that the laugh had a body to it, enough that I could feel the specific heat of it on the back of my neck, the old familiar heat of being the joke in a room full of men who have decided you are safe to laugh at. I have felt that heat in 12 countries in 40 states. I know its temperature exactly. I did not answer. I have never once in my entire life improved a moment like that by answering. I set a $5 bill on the bar for June, who did not need it and would not have taken it. and I reached down for the jacket I had hung on the hook under the bar, and I stood up to go. This is the part people never understand about restraint. They think it is weakness dressed up. It is not. Walking out of that bar was the single most powerful thing I could have done, and I knew it, and I was doing it, and the only cost was that 20 strangers would spend the rest of their night believing a story about me that was not true. I had paid that price so many times it did not even register as a price anymore. It was just the toll. You put your coins down and the gate goes up and you drive on. And as I stood and reached across my body for the jacket, my left sleeve rode up. It was nothing. It was 2 inches of forearm for less than a second. I pulled it back down almost before it happened, the reflex older than the insult, but almost is a very expensive word. And I was, that night, exactly 1/2 of 1 second too slow. The trick of disappearing was never in the mouth. I had known that since I was 24. The trick was always in the hands. And for the first time in 13 years, my hands lost the half second that mattered. 2 stools down from Reinhardt, a man I had not paid any attention to at all, a lean, quiet man drinking a beer by himself, went absolutely still. I did not see him go still. I only felt the change, the way you feel a temperature drop before you understand why. I had my jacket in my hand and my back half turned to the door, ready to be gone. And something in the room had shifted its weight, and every instinct I owned told me to leave faster, not slower. Because a shift like that almost never means anything good is about to happen to you. The still man set his beer down on the bar. He did it slowly and deliberately, the way you set something down when you have decided your hands are going to be busy. He stood. He was not big, not the way the 2 seals were big. He was built lean and economical. A man made of exactly what he needed and nothing extra. And he had the kind of stillness that is louder than any noise. And when he moved toward me, he did it without hurry and without threat. And he stopped a respectful arm's length away. And he looked at my left forearm, and then he looked at my face. And his own face had gone strange and open in a way that men like him almost never let their faces go. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low, meant for me and not the room, though the room had gone quiet enough now that it carried anyway. "I am sorry. I need to ask you something, and I need you to not walk out that door for about 30 seconds, if that is all right." I said nothing. I had my hand on my jacket and my weight already toward the exit. "That scar," he said. Left arm, inside, up past the elbow. Graft scar over a burn, older than 10 years. He was not guessing. That was the thing that stopped me, the flat certainty of it. The way a man says a thing he has actually seen and not a thing he is fishing for. I have seen that scar before. I was 19 years old. It was the other side of the world, and it was the worst night of my life, and I was on a roof, and there was a woman who came down a stairwell out of a fire with one of my guys on her back, and her arm looked like that. Exactly like that. He swallowed. I never knew her name. Nobody would ever tell us her name. The anchor was silent now. Even the jukebox seemed to have given up. Reinhardt had turned on his stool with the beginnings of a smirk still on his face, not yet understanding, waiting for the punchline. I want to tell you what 13 years of silence feels like when a stranger cracks it open in one sentence. It feels like a bone that healed crooked being rebroken to be set straight. It hurts in a way that is almost unbearable and is also, underneath the hurt, the first honest relief you have felt in longer than you can measure. In 13 years, no one had ever named it back to me. I had built an entire life, 9 duty stations, a whole architecture of long sleeves and change subjects, on the quiet certainty that no one ever would. And here was a lean, quiet stranger in a bar in the middle of the country, describing my own arm to me in the dark, telling me my own worst night as if it were his, which I understood with a lurch it was. It had been his too. He had been on the roof. He had been 19. "What is your name?" I said. It came out lower than I meant it to. "Rourke," he said. "Sergeant First Class Gideon Rourke. I was a private then." His jaw worked. "Ma'am, please, just do not leave yet." And then he took his phone out of his pocket, and he did not look away from me while he found the number, and he lifted it to his ear, and when whoever it was answered, he said only 6 words. "Top!" Come to the anchor, now." And he put the phone away, and he stood there in front of me with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes bright and terrible, waiting, like a man who has found something he stopped letting himself hope to find. Here's the thing no one tells you about being seen after you have spent years learning not to be. The first thing you feel is not relief. The first thing you feel is the almost overwhelming urge to run. Every muscle I had was telling me to end it. It would have been so easy. I could have said, gently, that he was mistaken, that a lot of people have scars, that he had me confused with someone braver, and I could have paid June and walked out into the July night and driven back to the motel and reported to my new post on Monday and never come within 600 miles of the anchor again. Rourke would have wondered for the rest of his life. The two SEALs would have had their laugh. And I would have been safe in the small, airless way that I had been safe for 13 years, which is to say alone with it, which is to say not safe at all, but familiar. And familiar and safe feel like the same thing when you are frightened enough for long enough. Reinhardt, sensing the room had gotten away from him and not understanding how, tried to grab it back. That is what men like that do. They mistake the size of a moment for a threat, and they try to shrink it with noise. "Come on, man," he said to Rourke, with a laugh that had gone thin at the edges. "Relax. She is nobody. Sit down, have your beer. It is not that deep." He looked around for the room to come back to him, for the laugh to return, and it did not. And I watched him feel it, not return. And I watched the first small, cold understanding move across his face that he might have stepped in something he could not see the edges of. Rourke did not sit down. He did not even look at Reinhardt. He kept his eyes on me, patient and certain, a man who had been on a roof at 19 and had spent a long time since then learning how to wait for the things that mattered. And I stood there with my jacket in my hand, at the exact center of the choice I had been avoiding for 13 years, without ever once admitting that it was a choice. I could disappear. I was very, very good at disappearing. It was the last reliable trick I owned. Or I could do the thing I had not done since 2012, the thing I did not know if I still knew how to do, which was to stand in a room and let a true thing about me be true out loud, with witnesses, and not apologize for it. I looked at Rourke's face. And under the sergeant, under the 13 years, I could see the boy. I could see the 19-year-old on the roof who had watched a woman come out of a fire and had spent his whole adult life not knowing her name. He was not asking me to perform. He was not asking me to prove anything or outrank anyone, or put the two loud men in their place. He was asking me, without saying it, for one thing only, to let him finally know that the woman on the stairwell had lived and had a name and was standing in front of him. For the first time in years, when every instinct told me to reach for the door, I did not reach for the door. I sat back down. I did it slowly, and I set my jacket back on the hook, and I put both of my forearms up on the bar in front of me, and I turned the left one over so the inside faced the light, and I stopped holding the sleeve. It slid back on its own, down toward my elbow, and there it was, in the yellow light of the anchor, in front of Rourke and the two SEALs and June and 20 strangers. 13 years of skin that had given up arguing, pale and shining and ridged, the map of the worst and truest night of my life, out in the open air for the first time in longer than most of the people in that room had known me. I had kept it covered so long that I had half convinced myself it belonged to somebody braver than me, somebody I was only pretending to be. That is what hiding a thing does. It slowly makes the thing feel stolen, even when it is the most honestly earned thing you own. Sitting at that bar, I let it be mine. It was a smaller and quieter act than it sounds, and it was the hardest thing I had done in a decade. His name, I said to Rourke, and my voice was steady, which surprised me, was Price. Nolan Price. He carried the 249 for his squad, and he never stopped complaining about the weight, and he would have shot anyone who tried to carry it for him. I looked up at Rourke's face. You were the tall one. On the saw 2 positions down from him, you had a cross drawn on your helmet cover in marker, because your sister sent it to you and told you to keep it visible. I do not know how I remembered that. I had not thought of it in 13 years. It came up out of the same place the smell of the smoke came from. You were the tall kid on the gun. I saw you on the roof when I came out. Whatever composure Rourke had been holding cracked, then cleanly, 1 single degree, the way ice cracks. His eyes filled and did not spill. Yes, ma'am, he said very quietly. That was me. he had to stop and start again. Nolan Price was my best friend in the entire world. We went through the whole thing together, and for 13 years I had been telling people about the woman who came down the stairwell with him, and I could never, ever finish the story because I never knew if you made it out of that country alive. Behind him, Reinhardt had gone completely silent. The smirk was gone. Something was happening in that bar that he had no framework for, and to his small credit, he had finally stopped trying to talk over it. The door opened. I felt the night air come in before I saw anyone, and then a man walked into the Anchor, and I did not need Rourke to tell me who he was, because some part of me had known that voice on the phone, the way you know a voice from a dream. He was in his middle 40s, gray coming in hard at the temples, built like a man who had spent 30 years refusing to soften, and he came through the door with 2 other men behind him, all 3 of them with the unmistakable bearing that no civilian clothes can hide. He stopped just inside the door and scanned the room the way I scan rooms, fast and total. And his eyes went to Rourke, and then Rourke's eyes moved to me, and the older man's gaze followed and landed on my forearm on the bar, and then on my face. And Command Sergeant Major Everett Salas, who 13 years before had been the senior non-commissioned officer on the ground the night Nolan Price died, walked across the Anchor very slowly and stopped in front of me. And for a long moment, he did not say anything at all. He just looked at the arm and then at me. And I watched a man who had almost certainly not cried in a decade fight it to a draw right there in front of everyone. "We looked for you," he said. His voice had gravel all the way through it. "For years. After you rotated out, the whole platoon wanted to find you, and every time we pushed it up the chain, they told us the CST rosters were restricted, and they would not release a name. We did not even know if you were still alive. Some of the guys thought you had died of that arm. We used to talk about you at every reunion. The woman who came down 2 flights out of a fire with Price on her back and her arm burning, and nobody could ever tell us who she was." He shook his head slowly. 13 years. And you were sitting in a bar in my town letting some kid tell you that you do not belong in a room with operators. He said the word operators the way you set down something heavy. And I watched it land on the 2 SEALs, because he was looking at them when he said it, and there is no rank in any service that carries the specific weight of a command sergeant major who has decided to look at you. Reinhardt and Maddox had risen off their stools without seeming to decide to. The way you stand when something in the deep structure of your training tells you to stand. And they were standing now at the edge of it all, with the expressions of 2 young men who have just understood, completely and at once, the exact dimensions of the mistake they made. The word they had thrown at me an hour before had a door in it. That is what the word operator is. It is a door, and it says who is allowed through. And it turned out that I had gone through that door a very long time ago, in the dark, on the worst night of my life. Behind and beside men, exactly like the 2 who had just informed me it was closed to me. I had not walked through it to prove anything. I had walked through it because a private named Nolan Price was on a floor that was on fire, and someone had to, and I was, who was there. Down the bar, June Alcott had gone quiet like everyone else. But she was moving. She reached up to the wall of framed photographs above the register, and she took one down, and she looked at it for a second with an expression I could not read, and then she set it on the bar facing the room and slid it toward me. It was a young ranger, maybe 22, tall and grinning, squinting into some foreign sun with a machine gun across his knees. On the corner of the frame was a small strip of black ribbon. "He has been up on my wall for 11 years, honey," June said quietly. "Boys from his unit put him there. I never knew the whole story." She looked at the arm on my bar and at me. "I think maybe you are part of it." It was Nolan Price. Of course it was. The one face on the wall I had been afraid to look at closely, and it had been watching over that bar for 11 years, and I had walked in and sat down beneath it without knowing. And the universe, which is not usually kind, had for once arranged something almost unbearably kind. I would like to tell you that I said something worthy of the moment. I did not. I looked at that photograph of Nolan Price grinning into the sun, and I put my hand over my mouth, and I did not make a sound, and I let the thing I had been carrying for 13 years move through me in front of a room full of strangers, and no one in that room looked away, and no one told me to pull myself together. Because every single person in it who had ever worn the uniform understood exactly what they were watching, and the ones who had not understood enough to be quiet. When I could speak, I did not speak to Salas or to Rourke. I turned on the stool, and I looked at the two SEALs, Reinhardt and Maddox, standing white-faced at the edge of it. And I want you to understand that I felt no urge at all to destroy them. I had every tool I needed to. I could have let Salas do it for me and never lifted a finger. A lesser night would have ended with those two young men humiliated out the door, and a certain kind of person would have called that justice. But I have spent my whole life around men Reinhardt's age, and I have buried enough of them, and I know something that is easy to forget when you are angry, which is that the loud, cruel thing a young man does in a bar is almost never the whole measure of him. It is usually just the part that is showing. Reinhardt came off the wall and crossed the small distance to me, and his face had nothing left of the smirk on it, and he stopped and he said, "Ma'am, I did not know." It was not much of a sentence, but he meant it all the way down, I could see that, and sometimes not much of a sentence meant all the way down is the most a person can offer. "You did not," I said. "That is true, you did not know." I let that sit for a second, because it was important, because it was the whole thing. "Now you do, and here is what I want you to do with it. I want you to sit back down, both of you. You do not have to leave. You did a stupid, cruel thing to a stranger tonight because you assumed you already knew everything worth knowing about her. And the lesson is not that you should feel terrible and go home. The lesson is that you do not, in fact, know who is in the room. You almost never do. So sit down and buy nothing and just listen for a while, because there was a man named Nolan Price, and you are standing in a bar with his photograph and the people who loved him, and the least you can do is learn who he was." Maddox, the quiet one, spoke for the first time. "How did he die?" he asked, and there was nothing challenging in it. He asked it the way you ask about a death you have decided to take seriously. So we told him. And in the telling, I learned things about Nolan Price that I had never known, because I had only had him for the worst 90 seconds and the 4 quiet days after. And these men had had him for years. Rourke told about how Price had once carried a stray dog for 11 miles inside his assault pack because the platoon had adopted it and it had hurt its paw, and how he had gotten in trouble for it and done it again the next week. Salas told about the time Price had given his own boots to a local kid whose feet were bleeding and then walked a patrol in borrowed ones, 2 sizes too big, and never said a word about the blisters. They told it the way you tell stories about someone you have decided to keep alive by refusing to let the good parts go quiet. And I sat there and let a boy I had known for 5 minutes at the end of his life become, at last, a whole person. And it was the kindest and the hardest gift anyone had given me in 13 years. Rourke told most of it, and Salas filled the parts Rourke had been too far away to see. And I said the pieces that were only mine to say, And the 2 young SEALs sat down at the edge of the circle and did the one genuinely good thing available to them, which was to shut up and listen and let a dead ranger become real to them. An hour before, they had owned that room. They had. Now they sat at its edge with their hands around beers they had stopped drinking, and they listened, and it was, I think, the beginning of them becoming better men than they had walked in as. That is all any reckoning is ever actually for. Not to break a person, to turn them. We stayed a long time. June kept the coffee coming and stopped pretending to run a business, and the regulars drifted over 1 and 2 at a time as the story moved through the bar, and by midnight the anchor had rearranged itself entirely. Not around anyone's rank, not around the fact that there was a major and a command sergeant major and a wall of quiet legend in the room, but around a photograph of a grinning 22-year-old and the woman who had carried him down 2 flights of stairs. I watched the 2 SEALs through all of it, because I have spent my career watching young men, and I could not quite help it. Reinhardt sat forward with his elbows on his knees and his jaw tight, and every so often he would start to say something and then stop himself, because he was smart enough to know that this was not a night for him to be talking. That is a hard thing for a young man of his kind to learn, when to be silent, and I could see him learning it in real time, at some cost. Maddox was different. Maddox asked questions, careful ones, spaced out, the questions of a person who has decided that the way to make amends for not caring an hour ago is to genuinely care now. At one point he asked whether Price had any family left, and Salas told him about the mother in Ohio, and Maddox nodded slowly and wrote something on the inside of his own forearm with a pen, a note to himself, and I do not know what he did with it later, but I have thought about it many times since. Those two walked into that bar as the loudest thing in the room, and they spent the back half of the night as its quietest students. And if you want to know whether people can change, I will tell you that I watched two of them start to over the course of a single evening, because the world put a truth in front of them that was too big to laugh at. Being seen is not free. I need to be honest with you about that, because I do not want to hand you a tidy ending. For 13 years, I had kept Nolan Price a secret, and I had told myself I was keeping him safe, keeping the grief clean, keeping the 4 days he lived from becoming a thing I performed for other people's comfort. Letting all of that out into a room full of people cost me something real. It reopened the 4 days. It reopened the hospital I was not allowed into, and the flag I was not family enough to hold, and the specific private arithmetic of guilt that I had done 10,000 times in the dark. The arithmetic that always came out the same way, that always concluded that being there had not been enough. But here's what I had never understood, sitting alone with it all those years. Rourke had been carrying the other half. For 13 years, he had been telling the story of the woman on the stairwell and never being able to finish it. Never knowing if I had lived, mourning me a little at every reunion right alongside Price. I had spent 13 years keeping Nolan a secret to keep him safe. And Rourke had spent the same 13 years keeping me alive in a story I never got to hear. We had each been carrying half of the same night, 600 miles and a whole life apart, and neither of us had known the other half existed. "You were one of ours that night," Salas said to me, late, when the crowd had thinned, and it was mostly just the core of us left around the end of the bar. "You have been one of ours every night since. You just did not have the address." He turned the coffee cup in his big hands. "That is on us, some of it. We should have been able to find you. The rules that kept your name locked up were written by people who were never on that roof." He looked at me steadily. "You do not have to carry it alone anymore. That is not an offer. That is just a fact, as of tonight. You are found now. There is no UE finding a person." And then I did the thing I had not been able to do in 13 years. I said the whole sentence out loud, to the room, to Nolan Price's photograph propped up on the bar in front of all of them. "I was there," I said. "I had him. And I am sorry it was not enough." I had said versions of that to myself 10,000 times in the dark, and every single time it had come out as an accusation. This was the first time I had ever said it out loud to other people, and not one person in that bar let it land as my fault. Rourke put his hand flat on the bar next to mine, not touching, just there. Salas shook his head slowly, and June, without a word, refilled Nolan's people's cups and left mine, because she understood that I needed both of my hands free for what I was setting down. I left the anchor a little after 1 in the morning, and I left at a different weight than I had walked in. June Alcott waved off my money at the door. When I tried to settle up, she just shook her head and pointed at a hand-lettered sign I had somehow not seen when I came in, over the register, next to the photographs. "Operators drink free on the last Friday of the month," it said, and June looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "It is the last Friday of the month, honey, and you have been an operator all night. House rule, take it up with the management." And I laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes up from somewhere you had forgotten you owned, and she smiled and told me to come back and meant it. Outside, the July night had cooled, and the parking lot of the anchor was full of motorcycles I had not registered on the way in. A couple dozen of them, lined up neat, most of them flying small flags off the back. Salas saw me looking. "Memorial ride," he said. "Every summer. We ride for the ones who did not come home. Price is on the list we read out, has been for 11 years. He was quiet for a second. "We roll out at 0700 from here tomorrow. Rourke will text you the details if you gave him your number, which you are going to." It was not quite an order. It was better than an order. It was an invitation from a man who did not extend them lightly. "Wear the sleeve up," he added, already turning toward the bikes. He did not make a thing of it. He just said it, over his shoulder, the way you tell someone to bring a jacket. "Wear the sleeve up." And I understood everything he meant by it, and I said I would. I traded numbers with Rourke in the parking lot under the sodium lights, and he shook my hand, and then, after a second of visible internal debate, He did not salute me because we were both in civilian clothes and it would have been wrong in about 4 different ways. But he came to a kind of attention for a half a second, just his spine finding its old line, and then he let it go and grinned like the boy from the roof, and it was worth more than any salute I have received before or since. The 2 SEALs, Reinhardt and Maddox, found me before I left. They did not grovel, which I respected. Reinhardt just put his hand out and said, "Thank you for not letting us off the hook and not burying us either." And I shook it, and Maddox shook it after, and they walked off into their night. Hopefully a little changed, and that was the last I ever saw of either of them, and I hope they are well, and I hope they remember. Then I walked to my truck across the base town, under the streetlights and the water tower and the tire shop sign, and I did it with my left forearm bare to the cool July air, the sleeve pushed up past the elbow, the scar out in the open, where anyone driving past could see it. And it did not feel like exposure. It did not feel like a thing coming undone. It felt like a name that had finally been said out loud after 13 years of being held under the tongue. It felt like the difference between a secret and a memory, which is the difference between something that eats you and something you get to keep. At 0700 the next morning, I was in that parking lot, in the gray early light, in borrowed leathers, 2 sizes too big that Rourke found for me in somebody's saddlebag, which made me think of Price and his blisters, and made me laugh, and then not laugh. There were maybe 30 riders. Salas gave a short briefing the way he had probably briefed 1,000 movements, calm and clear, the route and the pace and the rules. And then before we mounted up, he read the names. He read them from memory, not from a card, which is its own kind of monument. There were 14 of them, 14 men this particular group of riders carried every summer, and he read them slowly with a small pause after each one, and the pauses were the loudest part. When he read Nolan Price, something happened that had never happened in the 11 years they had been reading his name. A woman in the formation put her hand over her heart, and every rider there knew, because Rourke and Salas had made sure they knew, that for the first time the name was being read in the hearing of the person who had held him at the end. I do not know how to describe what that did to me, except to say that I had spent 13 years believing I had no place in the formation, no standing to grieve him out loud, that I was an outsider to his death, because I had not been family and had not even been ranger. And there I was, in the middle of them, one of 30, and no one questioned whether I belonged, because the question had been answered a long time ago on a stairwell, and it had only taken 13 years for the paperwork of the heart to catch up. We rode all day. I had not been on a bike in years, and my body remembered it the way bodies remember the important things, and the country opened up around us, green and enormous and indifferent in the good way, the way that makes your griefs feel survivable rather than small. And I did not keep my sleeve down. I rode the whole route with my left arm bare, and the wind found every ridge of that 13-year-old scar. And it did not feel like exposure. It felt like the first honest weather that skin had been allowed to feel in over a decade. And that is the whole of it, or the whole of it that belongs to me to give away. I want to say one thing to you before I go, and I want to say it to a very specific person, and if that person is not you, that is fine, you can pass it along. If you have spent years keeping your sleeve down, I understand. I understand better than almost anyone. We have all sorts of good reasons for it. We call it modesty, or discipline, or privacy, or letting the dead rest, or not making it about ourselves. And some of those reasons are even real, some of the time. But I will tell you what I learned in a bar called the Anchor 13 years too late. A great deal of what we call discipline is only fear that has learned to dress better. I had convinced myself that keeping the scar covered was a form of strength, when the truth was that it had become the exact opposite. It had become the thing that kept me alone with the worst night of my life for over a decade. When there was a man 600 miles away carrying the other half of it the whole time. You do not owe the whole world your scar. Let me be clear about that. Not everyone has earned the right to see the truest thing about you, and there is wisdom, not weakness, in keeping some things covered from people who would only mishandle them. But do not, please do not, let a room full of people who never carried anything heavier than their own opinion of themselves tell you which doors are closed to you. They do not know who is in the room. They almost never do. And somewhere out there, closer than you think, there is one person who was on the roof. One person who saw what you did in the dark and has been trying to finish the story ever since. Let them see it, say the name. Turn your arm over on the bar and stop holding the sleeve. You will be surprised, I promise you, who stands up. I was there. I had him. And 13 years later, a stranger in a bar reminded me that being there was never the thing I needed to apologize for. It was the thing I got to be proud of. It just took me a while, and a burned arm, and a wall of photographs, and 2 rude young men, and 1 lean, quiet ranger who never forgot a scar to finally let it be mine.